The plate hadn't been touched. That was the first thing Kaler Devon noticed when he stepped through the wide double doors of the main hall. Not the laughter. Not the warm light spilling across the polished marble floor. Not even the way his sons, Zalen and Breck, were crouched together near the far couch, shoulders shaking with something that looked like amusement. The plate. White ceramic. Steam still rising off whatever had been put on it. Pushed close to the baseboard like it had been placed there as an afterthought. And beside it, on the cold marble floor, sat Riven, barefoot, knees pulled to his chest, eyes down. He wasn't crying. That was the part that hit hardest. No tears, no protest, just stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm, comes from practice. Kaler didn't move from the doorway. He should have crossed the room. Anyone watching would have expected exactly that. A stride forward, a voice raised, a correction made. That was the natural move. But something locked his feet in place. Naira Voss stood near the kitchen archway. Her posture was relaxed, one hand resting loosely on the counter edge. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't even frowning. Her voice, when it came, was light, almost instructive, like she was explaining something simple to someone slow. "You eat when you've earned it," she said. "That's how the world works, baby. The sooner he understands that, the better off he'll be." Zalen laughed again. Breck followed, the way younger brothers always follow. A half-second late, copying the pitch and the length like he wasn't entirely sure what was funny but wanted to be part of it anyway. Riven didn't look up. He just shifted slightly, pulled his knees tighter. Kaler's jaw did something he didn't let his face finish. He breathed. Once. Slow. The marble floor under Riven was cold. He could see that from across the room. Cold and hard and completely visible from every angle in the hall. There was nothing private about where Riven had been placed. This was the center of the house. The main hall. The place guests walked through. The place staff moved through every hour of the day. The plate had been put there on purpose. And that word, purpose, landed somewhere deep and quiet in Kaler's chest, and he held it there without moving. He watched Naira turn toward the kitchen without glancing at Riven once. He watched Zalen and Breck drift back toward whatever they'd been doing before. He watched the room rearrange itself like nothing had happened. Like a boy sitting alone on a cold floor with an untouched plate beside him was just part of the background. Like furniture. Kaler still didn't speak. He looked at the back of Riven's head. The slight curve of his spine. The way his fingers were pressed flat against the side of his own leg. Not holding anything, just pressing. Hi viewers. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt that something had been going on for a long time before you got there? Drop the word pattern in the comments if you've ever felt that. The worst part wasn't what he'd just seen. The worst part was what he felt in his own body, a recognition. A dull, quiet recognition. Not shock. Not even anger. Something closer to. This is not new. He didn't know when he'd first noticed it. The exact moment was gone. But standing in that doorway, watching the steam curl off an untouched plate, watching his son sit alone on cold marble in the middle of his own home, Kaler realized he hadn't walked in on a moment. He'd walked in on the middle of something that had already been running. He took one step back. Then he stopped. And he stayed there. Because something told him, loudly, clearly, in the part of him that had always known how to read a room, that the worst thing he could do right now was let Naira know he'd seen it. This wasn't the first time. It was just the first time he'd stayed long enough to see it. The hallway outside Riven's room was never loud. Even on the busiest mornings, when Zalen and Breck were crashing into walls and the staff was moving between floors with linens and trays, the hallway outside Riven's door sat quiet. Kaler had passed it 100 times. Never thought much about it. He was thinking about it now. He stood at the edge of the south corridor, 3 days after the night in the main hall, and he let his mind pull backward. Not dramatically. Not in some flood of sudden memory. Just quietly. The way you check your pockets when you realize something's missing. When had Riven started eating alone? He couldn't place the exact date. And that bothered him. He remembered a period. maybe 6, 7 months back, when all three boys sat together at the long table near the east window. He had a vague image of it. Riven somewhere near the middle. Zaylin talking too loud. Breck trying to eat and talk at the same time and managing neither. Then at some point that image stopped. He couldn't tell you the day it changed. He couldn't point to a decision or a rule or a conversation that had moved Riven to the edges of the household. But it had happened. Slowly. And he had missed it. Not because he hadn't been home. He'd been home. He'd walked those halls. He'd eaten at that table. He'd sat in that main room. But something had been shifting in the background, quiet, low, consistent, and he had not caught it. He started paying attention to the staff. Not confrontationally. Not with questions. He just watched. And what he noticed first was small. Too small to name in the moment, but not too small to feel. When Riven asked Mina, one of the household's senior staff, where his jacket had been placed, she answered without looking at him. Technically correct. Fully distant. The kind of response that followed a pattern someone had been trained into. Kaylor watched Breck ask the same woman where his shoes were. She stopped what she was doing, turned, smiled, answered with full attention. That could mean nothing, but he filed it. He watched the guards too. Not their patrol routes, their posture. There's a difference in the way a person carries themselves around someone they respect versus someone they've been told, quietly, indirectly, doesn't quite rank. Around Zaylin, the guards straightened slightly. Around Riven, they looked at the floor. Cruelty rarely starts loud. It trains quietly. He thought about that phrase more than once over the following days. He hadn't said it out loud. He'd thought it while watching his household move, and what struck him wasn't the cruelty itself. It was how well run it was. How clean. No one was cruel to Riven's face. No one raised a voice at him. No one said anything that could be pointed at directly. But the walls of his environment had been built inch by inch. And now he was living in them without even knowing they were walls. Kaylor pulled one more thread. He thought about his sons. Zaylin and Breck were not bad children. He knew that. But children learn how to feel about people by watching how everyone else treats those people. They weren't born laughing at their brother on a cold floor. Something had been teaching them. That thought sat heavier than the rest. Because it pointed somewhere specific. It pointed to a pattern. Too consistent to be coincidental, too quiet to be accidental. Someone had been building this piece by piece. Not with rage. Not with obvious cruelty. With repetition. With small corrections. Small removals. Small moments of exclusion stacked so neatly on top of each other that from a distance, they looked like nothing. And Kaylor had watched it happen from a distance. He exhaled through his nose. He walked back down the hallway. The door to Riven's room passed on his left. No sound from inside. He kept walking. But one question sat at the front of his mind, sharp and still. If the behavior had been learned, then someone had been teaching it. Kaylor found his sons in the game room. Not because he'd looked for them there, because that's where they always were at that hour after dinner before anyone told them to do something else. Zaylin was on the floor, back against the couch, controller in hand. Breck was beside him, half watching, half playing a game on a separate device. Kaylor stepped in and closed the door behind him. Neither boy reacted immediately. Then Zaylin looked up. Then Breck followed. "Hey," Zaylin said, casual. The greeting of someone who didn't expect anything unusual. Kaylor crossed to the chair across from them and sat down. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand over them. He just sat, elbows on his knees, hands loosely folded, and he looked at them the way he'd look at a problem he was working out from scratch. "Tell me what happened the other night," he said. In the main hall, Zaylin's expression shifted. Not guilt exactly. Awareness. Riven was just sitting there, he said. Naira told him. "I know what Naira told him," Kaylor said. Flat. Not harsh. "I'm asking you. What did you see?" Breck looked at Zaylin. Zaylin looked back at their father. "She said he hadn't done what she asked," Zaylin said carefully. "So he had to wait. And that was funny to you?" Silence. This was the part where most people would rush to fill. Most people would launch into explanations or backpedal or look for the exit. Kaler let the silence stay exactly where it was. He'd learned a long time ago that silence does more work than most sentences. Zaylin looked down. Not like, we weren't laughing at him. What were you laughing at? No answer. You don't know, Kaler said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just true. He said it the way you say something that lands differently than a question would. You don't actually know what you found funny. You heard someone make it sound okay to laugh. So you did. Breck shifted on the floor. Go get Riven, Kaler said. Zaylin blinked. Right now. Right now. Zaylin went. Kaler waited. He could hear footsteps down the hall. A door. Low voices. Then footsteps again, slower this time. Riven came in first. He stood near the door, not quite in the room. His posture was the same as it always was, not slumped, not aggressive. Just pulled inward, like he'd learned to take up less space than he actually had. When a child says nothing, it usually means everything hurt at once. Kaler didn't look at Riven yet. He looked at his other two sons. You two can go, he said. They left without protest. That surprised him slightly. But it told him something, too. They already knew enough to know when to stop being in a room. Riven hadn't moved. Kaler finally turned to him. He gestured toward the chair Zaylin had been leaning against. Sit. Riven sat. How are you? Kaler asked. Riven looked at him. Fine. Okay. He didn't push. That word, fine, carried more weight than the person saying it usually understood. But he wasn't going to interrogate a child who'd already been made to feel too small in his own house. He stored it and moved on. You don't have to explain anything, he said. I'm not here to put you in the middle of something. I just want you to know I saw what happened. Riven said nothing. You hear me? A small nod. Kaler sat back in his chair and looked at the room for a moment. Quiet. He made the decision right there, in that chair, without ceremony. He wasn't going to walk into Naira's room and confront her directly. Not yet. Not before he understood the full width of what he was looking at. He chose to observe the system, not just the moment. That meant watching longer, moving slower, not reacting where he could be seen reacting. Because here was the thing, if he walked in swinging, the system would simply shift, adjust, reroute, and he'd never see it clearly again. He would need to see it clearly. He told Riven he could go. Riven stood, moved toward the door, and paused for just a second with his hand on the frame, like he was waiting for something else. Some condition, some catch. None came. He left. Kaler stayed in the chair a few more minutes. Down the hall, he heard movement. Naira's voice, light and ordinary, saying something to the staff about the morning schedule. She had no idea he'd just had this conversation. No idea what he was turning over in his mind. She expected him to have reacted the way he always had before, in the moment directly with noise. He hadn't. He didn't stop her. And that was what made her uneasy. He started with the mornings. Mornings were when a household showed itself. Not at night when people were tired and less careful. Not at dinner when everyone was performing the version of themselves they wanted to be seen as. Mornings. Early, before the structure of the day had been assembled, that was when you saw behavior in its natural state. Kaler woke at 5. He'd always woken at 5. But now, instead of going straight to his office, he moved through the house first. Quietly, without announcing himself. He'd get coffee from the kitchen before the staff rotated shifts, and he'd just exist in whatever room he happened to be passing through. What he was looking for wasn't dramatic. He wasn't looking for confrontations or obvious cruelty. He'd already established that it wouldn't look like that. What he was looking for was patterns. Language. The small, repeated choices that shape an environment without anyone pointing to them directly. On the third morning, he caught something in the kitchen. One of the staff, a young man named Tobias, who had been with the household for 2 years, was arranging breakfast items on the counter. Riven came in from the back stairwell. He asked quietly if there was anything for him to eat before the main meal was set. Tobias didn't ignore him. He answered. He just answered with a specific kind of language. That's not really for you, he said, gesturing at the fruit tray. That's for the main table. Riven nodded and left. Kaler stayed where he was, coffee in hand, and filed it. The fruit tray had been set out for everyone. There was no distinction between the main table items and general items. Tobias hadn't been told, in any official instruction Kaler had ever given, that the fruit was reserved. He hadn't invented that distinction on his own either. People don't invent distinctions. They inherit them. By the second week, Kaler had 3 more moments like it. Different staff members, different rooms, different small redirections, all of which separately could be explained away as coincidence. But lined up together, they formed something too consistent to be individual. He wrote nothing down. He stored it. Then came the language. This was the part that stopped him. He was in the east corridor when he heard Breck explaining something to a household aide. The aide had asked why Riven didn't sit at the main table for certain meals. And Breck, 11 years old, matter of fact, not even slightly aware that he was saying something unusual, said, "He prefers it that way. He gets overwhelmed." Kaler paused. He'd heard that phrase before. Not from Breck. Not from the aide. He'd heard it from Naira. Word for word. The same phrase. The same framing. Gets overwhelmed. Like it was a documented condition. Like it was something Riven himself had expressed and agreed to. Like it explained and justified every separate arrangement that had quietly moved Riven to the edges of his own household. He stood in that corridor for a long moment. This wasn't influence. It was programming. Different people. Different rooms. Different conversations. All of them using the same language to describe the same child in the same way, and none of them questioning where that language had come from. They didn't have to question it. They'd been given it ready-made. Easy. Reasonable sounding. Hard to push back against because it didn't sound like a rule. It sounded like concern. And concern is the most useful thing to weaponize because it looks like care. Kaler moved toward the south wing. He wasn't angry. He was precise. This wasn't something he could unwind in one conversation, one confrontation, one clear moment of naming. This was layered. Built. It had roots in enough people's thinking that pulling one thread would just make others tighten. He needed to understand the center of it before he touched anything. He needed to understand who had built this and exactly how far it had been built. He already knew the answer. He just needed to look at it directly. This wasn't influence. It was programming. Naira was in the sitting room. She was reading or doing the thing that looked like reading. Legs crossed, book open, posture relaxed. She looked like someone who had no concerns. Someone who had arranged everything she wanted to arrange and was simply living inside the arrangement. Kaler closed the door behind him. She looked up. Her expression didn't change. That was the first thing. He pulled a chair from near the window and sat across from her. No desk between them. No assistant nearby. He'd made sure of that. "Tell me something," he said. She set the book down. "Okay. What do you believe about weak children?" She held his gaze. No flinch. "I believe weakness left unaddressed becomes permanent." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that alongside everything else. "And you think Riven is weak?" "I think Riven has not been taught what strength requires," she said. "There's a difference." She said it the way someone says something they've said privately to themselves many times. Fluent. Finished. Not improvised. "So you decided to teach him." "I decided to stop pretending the problem didn't exist," she said. "Someone has to see it. Someone has to name it. The worst thing you can do for a child who struggles is act like he doesn't." Kaler said nothing. "You think I'm wrong," she said. "I think you believe you're right," he replied. "Which isn't the same thing." She tilted her head slightly, the first small crack in her composure. Not because she was upset, because she was recalibrating. She'd expected him to come in with heat. She'd prepared for heat. And heat was something she knew how to manage. She'd probably been managing it her whole life. What she was looking at now wasn't heat. It was colder than that. And she wasn't sure what to do with cold. "You've been shaping this for months," he said. "Not Riven. The environment. The way people speak about him. The things they take for granted. The phrases they repeat." He paused. "You've been building a world in which Riven isn't mistreated. He's just correctly placed." She didn't deny it. That was the twist. She didn't lean back and say, "I don't know what you're talking about." She didn't deflect or play confused. She looked at him steadily and said, "Yes," one word. And then, "Because someone had to. Because you weren't doing it." And the longer you leave a child like that without structure, real structure, not comfort, not coddling, the further he gets from being able to function. "A child like what?" Kaylor asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. "What kind of child did you decide he was?" he pressed. "Before you decided what to do about him?" Silence. The most dangerous people aren't liars. They're the ones who believe they're right. And Naira believed. That was the thing. He could see it sitting in her expression. Not guilt, not cruelty. Certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need to hide because it genuinely does not believe it has done anything wrong. She had looked at a child and decided what he was. And then she had spent months building a world that confirmed that decision. Not because she hated Riven. Because she believed in her own diagnosis so completely that the treatment had seemed not just acceptable but necessary. That was the ideology. That was the thing he was dealing with. Not a liar. Not a villain calculating harm in the dark. Someone who had looked at a complicated child and decided, cleanly, that what he needed was to be shown how little tolerance the world had for softness. Kaylor leaned back slightly. "We're not done talking," he said quietly. She nodded. "I know." But she wasn't afraid of him. He could see that too. He stood, crossed to the door, and stopped with his hand on the handle, back still turned to her, because what he needed to say next wasn't a confrontation. It was a fact. "The problem isn't what you did," he said. "It's that you believed it was necessary." He opened the door and walked out. Behind him, for the first time since he'd entered that room, Naira didn't have a response ready. The problem wasn't what she did. It was that she believed it was necessary. The first change nobody saw coming was the quietest one. Kaylor didn't call a meeting, didn't send a memo, didn't pull anyone into a room and deliver a speech about what was going to be different from now on. He just started watching differently. And watching, when done by the right person, changes a room without a single word being spoken. It started with the morning rotations. He restructured which staff members were assigned to which areas of the house. Not dramatically, a shift here, a reassignment there. Tobias moved from the kitchen corridor to the east wing. Mina's schedule changed so that she was no longer the first person Riven encountered in the mornings. Small moves, the kind that take weeks to feel. Then he introduced what he quietly called behavior reviews. Not official, not labeled. Just, he began sitting in on things he'd never sat in on before. Meals. Morning check-ins between staff and the boys. The informal conversations that happened in hallways and common rooms that nobody thinks anyone important is paying attention to. He was paying attention. And the effect was almost immediate. Not because anyone got in trouble. Because they didn't know if they might. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Direct punishment tells you what not to do in the moment you're caught. Observation tells you that the standard is constant. You can't calculate your way around it. You can't wait for the right moment. Someone is always watching, and you start behaving accordingly, even when no one's actually there. The staff adjusted within 2 weeks. The language around Riven changed first. Slowly, and without anyone acknowledging it directly, the phrases that had been circulating. Gets overwhelmed, prefers it that way, started disappearing from conversations. Not because anyone had been told to stop. Because the person who had been reinforcing those phrases was no longer in a position to do so unchecked. Naira had not been removed. She was still in the house, still present at meals, still part of the household's daily structure. But she was being watched, and she knew it. That matters. Pause on that. Because the power in what Kaler was doing wasn't punishment. It was disruption. He was dismantling the reinforcement loops that had kept the system running. One by one, quietly, without announcing that any of them had ever existed. He watched his sons. Zaylan stopped the habit of making small comments at Riven's expense. Not because his father had told him to stop. Kaler hadn't said a word to him about it directly since that night in the game room. But Zaylan was 13 and observant enough to feel the temperature of a room shift. He could sense, without being able to name it, that the household had changed its center of gravity. Breck was slower to adjust. Breck always was. But by the third week, even Breck had stopped doing the thing where he'd look at Zaylan first before reacting to something Riven did. That checking instinct, that quick scan for permission to treat his brother as less. He wasn't doing it anymore. Not fully. But he was hesitating. And hesitation, in a child still forming his habits, is everything. Riven still wasn't sitting at the main table every meal. He still kept his distance in the common rooms. He still answered questions with the minimum number of words required. The structural changes Kaler was making hadn't reached him yet. Not in any way he could feel. Sometimes the victim isn't broken. The environment is. Kaler understood now, more clearly than when he'd first walked into that hallway, that you can clean a room without the person who lived in the mess immediately trusting that it's clean. That's not failure. That's reality. Riven had spent months, possibly longer, in an environment that had been quietly teaching everyone around him how to treat him. That didn't dissolve in 3 weeks. But something else had started. His sons were beginning to feel pressure from a direction they hadn't expected. Not punishment. Not anger. Observation. For the first time in a long time, Zaylan and Breck were aware that they were being watched. Not to be caught. Not to be corrected. Just watched. And something about that awareness was making them look at the things they did more carefully. They didn't say anything about it. They didn't have to. Kaler could see it in the way they moved around Riven now. Slightly more careful. Slightly less automatic. Like they were running their own behavior through a filter that hadn't existed a month ago. For the first time, they realized they were being watched too. The house was quieter now. Not empty quiet. Not cold quiet. Just different. The kind of quiet that settles into a place when the patterns that used to fill it stop running. When the machinery underneath the noise gets switched off one piece at a time and you don't notice how loud it was until it's gone. Kaler noticed. He also noticed what the quiet didn't fix. 3 weeks of restructuring. 2 weeks of observation. 1 careful, controlled dismantling of everything that had been built in that household around one child's perceived position. And the result was, by every measurable standard, working. Staff behavior had shifted. Language had corrected. His sons were more careful. Naira had withdrawn into a quiet that was nothing like peace. It was recalculation. He could see her recalculating every time she passed him in the hall. Her posture slightly less settled. Her voice slightly more considered. The system had responded. The person at the center of it hadn't. Riven was still pulling away. Not dramatically. Not in a way that made scenes or demanded attention. That wasn't his style. Kaler understood that now. Riven's method of pulling away was smaller than that. He was present in every room he was supposed to be in. He answered when spoken to. He ate his meals at the table now. Kaler had quietly made that a non-negotiable part of the morning structure. But he was somewhere else. Behind his eyes. Somewhere that the structural changes hadn't reached. Somewhere that new schedules and corrected staff behavior and brothers who hesitated before being careless. Somewhere none of that was touching. Kaler watched him at breakfast one morning. Riven with a glass of juice he hadn't drunk. Fork moving through food without any real interest. Zaylan tried twice to start a conversation. Riven answered both times. Short, complete, correct. Then silence. Changing a system is fast. Changing a person is not. He'd known this. Intellectually, he'd known this from the beginning. He'd told himself, in the early days of this whole quiet dismantling project, that healing wasn't a switch you flipped when you fixed the environment. That people don't heal on the same schedule as policies. But knowing something and watching it happen in front of you are two entirely different experiences. He watched Riven leave the table before anyone else finished eating. Nobody stopped him. Nobody said anything unkind. Nobody made a face or exchanged a look. The table just let him leave correctly, appropriately, according to all the new patterns Kaler had installed. And Riven left anyway, like the emptiness was still there, just quieter now, just less visible. That afternoon, Kaler passed Riven in the east corridor. Riven was coming from his room. Kaler stopped, said his name. Riven stopped too, turned. "You doing all right?" Kaler asked. "Yeah," Riven said. Not yeah with feeling. Not yeah with relief. Just yeah. The same single syllable he'd been offering anyone who asked for the past several months. A door that opens 1 inch and shows you nothing. Kaler nodded. Let him go. He stood in that corridor for a while after. This was the part he hadn't fully prepared for. He'd spent so much mental energy on the architecture, what to dismantle, in what order, with what level of visibility, that he hadn't sat with the fact that the person most affected by all of it was the one person who had no idea any of it was happening. Riven didn't know the staff language had changed. Didn't know Naira was now operating under a different kind of pressure. Didn't know his brothers were hesitating where they used to be automatic. None of those changes had been announced to him. How could they be without making the whole situation worse? Without making him feel like a case being managed, a problem being solved, a child who needed to be handled? So he was living in a house that had changed. But nobody had told him it changed. And the part that had already gotten into him, the part that had learned to expect less, to take up less space, to answer with the minimum and keep everything else locked somewhere interior, that part hadn't gotten the memo. Maybe couldn't get the memo. Not this way. Not through structure. Kaler walked back toward his office. He sat at his desk and didn't open anything. Fixing everything didn't fix him. It was a Wednesday. No particular reason it had to be Wednesday. But that's when it happened, so that's what it was. Kaler had been in his office most of the morning. Around noon he got up, walked through the main hall, checked his phone once, put it down, and went looking for Riven the way you go looking for someone when you've been circling the right moment for days and you've finally decided to stop waiting for it. He found him in the small reading room off the south corridor. Not reading, just sitting. One leg up on the chair, arm resting across his knee. Window light coming in from the left side and doing nothing about the expression on his face. Kaler came in, sat down across from him, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd. He didn't open with a question. He just said, "You don't have to say anything." Riven looked at him. "I'm not here to get something out of you," Kaler said. "I just want to be in the room." Riven looked back at the window. They sat like that for a while. 3, maybe 4 minutes. Long enough to be uncomfortable if you weren't used to sitting in silence. Long enough to feel like something if you were. Kaler was the one who spoke next. "I noticed something," he said. "Careful. Not dramatic. Just honest. The way you moved through this house. You weren't surprised by things. Bad things. You moved like you already knew they were coming." Riven said nothing. "And that told me something," Kaler said. "It told me the things I saw, they weren't new. They weren't accidents. They weren't isolated." He paused. "They were normal to you." The silence that followed that sentence had a different texture than the one before it. Riven's hand moved on his knee. Just slightly. "You expected it," Kaler said. Quietly. "All of it." Riven didn't confirm it out loud. But he didn't deny it either. And the thing about a person who has been trained to say nothing is that their silence is louder than most people's answers. That means it happened before. Long before. Kaler felt something move through him that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. Something between the two. "When did you stop thinking it would be different?" he asked. Riven's eyes came back to him. For a second, just a second, something in them shifted. Like the question had reached somewhere that other people's questions hadn't. Then it closed again. "I don't know," Riven said. "That's honest," Kaler said. Another long beat. "I kept trying for a while," Riven said. The words came out like he was testing the weight of them before setting them down. I kept doing stuff, like trying to be around more, be better at things, be more. He stopped. It didn't matter. What happened when it didn't matter? Riven looked at the window again. I stopped trying to be seen. The deepest damage isn't pain. It's expectation of pain. Kaler sat with that for a long moment, not rushing past it, not filling it with a response he didn't mean. He had built structures, changed schedules, disrupted systems, done everything that could be done from the outside, moving the pieces of a household back into a position that at least resembled fairness. And all of it, had done nothing about the fact that sitting across from him was a child who had quietly, carefully, over the course of months, dismantled his own hope. Not explosively, not in protest, brick by brick, decision by decision. Each time the environment confirmed that being seen wasn't available to him, he'd made the internal adjustment, reduced the expectation, lowered the floor, until the floor was so low that not being seen wasn't a wound anymore. It was just Tuesday, or Wednesday, just another ordinary day. I hear you, Kaler said. Riven nodded. Small. I'm not going to tell you it's fixed, Kaler said, because I don't know that it is. And I think you've been told things were fine when they weren't enough times that I'm not going to be another person who does that. Riven went still. The words had landed somewhere. Kaler could see it, not in a big visible shift, just in the way Riven's shoulders released something almost imperceptible, like a door that had been held shut by pressure, and someone had just removed a small piece of the pressure. Not open, not yet, but something different than before. I didn't disappear, Riven said. His voice was low, even. The words came out without tremor. Not because he wasn't feeling anything, but because he'd been keeping his voice level for a long time and didn't know how to stop. You just stopped noticing. The sentence hung between them. Kaler didn't defend himself against it, didn't explain, didn't offer the reasons. He let it stand exactly as Riven had placed it, true, clean, and long overdue. You're right, he said, and that was all. 3 days after that Wednesday, Kaler requested a private meeting with Naira. Not a confrontation, not a reckoning. Those words would have been wrong for what he was building toward. This was something colder and more deliberate than either of those things. This was a decision being delivered by someone who had already made it, and who was giving the other person one careful opportunity to respond before the decision became permanent. He chose the study, neutral space, no staff nearby. Morning light through the tall east windows, which at that hour came in flat and clear and didn't flatter anything. Naira arrived on time. Of course she did. She always did. She sat across from him and she waited. She was good at waiting. He'd always known that about her. She had the kind of patience that comes not from calm but from control, from believing that she could outlast whatever was coming. He let her wait for exactly 1 minute. Then he spoke. There are 2 ways this goes, he said. And I want to be clear that both options are yours to choose from. I'm not taking the choice away from you. She tilted her head, listening. Option 1, he said. You remain in this household, with conditions. You do not frame Riven to the staff. You do not frame him to his brothers. You do not frame him to anyone in this house in any way that positions him as less capable, less deserving, or less worthy of space than anyone else here. Any conversation you have about him that I learn about through any means that contradicts that, the conditions are over. He let that sit. Option 2, he said. You remove yourself from influence in this household permanently. Not physically. I'm not asking you to leave the property. I'm asking you to leave the environment you've been building. Every conversation, every pattern, every framing, you step out of it. Not gradually. Now. Naira held his gaze. She did not look threatened. That was the thing. She looked calculating, like she was running both options through the system she'd built in her mind and determining which one gave her the most to work with. You're not angry, she said. No, he said. You were at some point, she said. Yes, he said. I was. That's not what this is. She was quiet for a long moment. I want you to understand something, she said finally. I didn't build what I built because I wanted to hurt him. I built it because I believed I was doing something necessary. Something no one else was willing to do. I know that, Kaler said. And you still. It doesn't change the result, he said. Believing something is necessary doesn't make the damage it causes any less real. You can be certain and wrong at the same time. Most of the worst things that happen are done by people who were certain. Naira looked at her hands. For the first time since this whole quiet war had started, she didn't immediately have a response ready. And that hesitation, that small crack in the precision she always carried, told him something he hadn't been sure of until that exact moment. She was hearing him, not agreeing, not surrendering, not changing her internal belief system in the span of a single conversation. But hearing him, that was more than he'd expected. Power doesn't destroy, he said quietly. It decides what continues to exist. Naira looked up. What continues to exist in this house, he said, is going to be something Riven can actually live in, not something designed around a version of him that you decided was true. She nodded, very slightly, not agreement, something more complicated than agreement. He stood. She stayed seated. Think about it, he said, not cruelly. You have until tomorrow morning. He crossed to the door. Naira's voice came from behind him. You didn't lose either, she said. He stopped, turned slightly. What do you mean? In this whole thing, she said, you didn't lose either. You just changed what it was. He looked at her for a moment. You didn't lose, Kaler said quietly. You just stopped being necessary. He left the room, and behind the closed door, Naira sat alone in the flat morning light, and for the first time in a long time, she had no idea what came next. The last scene doesn't announce itself. That's the thing about the moments that matter most. They don't come with music. They don't come with preparation. They arrive the same way everything else does. Quietly, without warning, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon when you're not expecting anything to shift. It was a Saturday. Late afternoon light, the color of something just about to cool down. The house had been moving slowly all day. No big events, no structural decisions, no carefully managed conversations. Just the ordinary movement of people inside a space they shared. Riven was in the main sitting room, alone but not hiding. That was the difference. He wasn't tucked into a corner of the house where no one would pass. He was just sitting, in one of the chairs that faced the wide windows, reading something, or trying to. Kaler came in from the hallway. He wasn't looking for Riven specifically. He was moving through, the way you move through your own house on a slow day when there's nothing pressing in any direction. He saw Riven. Riven saw him. Neither of them made a production of it. Kaler sat down. Not far. Not right next to him. In the chair across the low table. Anything good? He asked, nodding toward whatever Riven was reading. Riven looked at the page. Not really. Why are you reading it? Because I started it, Riven said. Kaler almost smiled. They stayed in the room. The light moved slowly across the floor. Outside, somewhere past the window, one of the other boys was doing something that involved footsteps and something being dropped and then footsteps again. They let the noise be noise. You seem less gone, Kaler said. He said it the same way you say something you've been sitting with for a while, without build-up. Not a statement designed to produce a reaction. Just an observation, offered plainly. Riven didn't answer right away. He looked at the book, then at the window. I don't know if that's true, he said. Okay, Kaler said. I think I'm just... Hear more, Riven said. Which is different. Kaler considered that. It was different. He was right. Being present in a space and being gone from inside yourself at the same time was a real and specific kind of hurt. And the shift out of it didn't come in one piece. Came in increments so small you almost couldn't name them. Being here more. That was one of them. You don't have to trust all of this yet, Kaler said. He gestured at the room, at the house, at the general territory of what had changed. I'm not asking you to trust it because I made changes. That's not how it works. Riven was quiet. I know, he said. You know, Kaler said. You've known the difference between real and managed your whole life. That's not a small thing. Riven turned and looked at him. Really looked. Not the quick glance. Not the checking look that lasted 1 second and retreated. A real, full look. The kind that costs something. Trust isn't rebuilt in moments. It's rebuilt in patterns. Kaler held the look. Then Riven turned back toward the window. He didn't pull away. That was the thing. He didn't scoot the chair back. Didn't find a reason to leave. Didn't retreat into one-word answers and careful distance. He just turned back to the window and stayed. The room stayed quiet for a long while after that. Long enough that the light shifted again. Long enough that the sound from outside disappeared and came back and disappeared again. Long enough that sitting in the same room together started to feel less like a managed moment and more like just two people in the same place at the same time, not running from it. At some point, Riven leaned slightly sideways in his chair. Not toward Kaler. Not away. Just settled. Like a person who had finally decided, quietly and without ceremony, that the chair was safe to sit all the way in. He didn't speak. Kaler didn't either. The bond wasn't broken. It had changed. And Kaler, watching the light move across the floor, realized something, slowly, and without the comfort of certainty, that he was no longer in control of what it would become. That had always been the real work. Not fixing the house. Not correcting the system. Not confronting Naira. The real work was this room. This chair. This boy who had stopped disappearing by a degree small enough that most people would miss it. And the man across from him who had finally, after far too long, stopped being too far away to see it. The bond wasn't broken. It had changed. And where it was going next, neither of them could tell you. That was the only honest ending. And that's where the story rests. Not wrapped up clean. Not fixed in a bow. Because real healing doesn't end like that. It ends like this, with two people in the same room, both still figuring it out and neither of them leaving. If the story moved you, if you've ever been the one sitting on the cold floor, or the one who came in too late and had to earn their way back, drop something in the comments. Share what this meant to you. Your words might be exactly what someone else in this community needs to read today. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss the next story. Everyone we share is a chance to see something true, feel something real, and maybe recognize a piece of your own life in someone else's. The next story is already coming, and you're going to want to be here for it.